It was the kind of evening that began like any other on the Steve Harvey Show. The music pumping through the speakers, the lights flashing, and the audience buzzing with excitement. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage with his usual confidence, a smile on his face, and his signature swagger. He greeted the crowd with his infectious energy, the air in the studio electric. The audience was ready for the usual banter, the laughter, the jokes, anything that would make their night a little brighter. But tonight, something was different. As Steve stood there holding his cue cards, he felt a subtle shift in the room. It wasn't the typical lighthearted energy he was accustomed to. This felt more intense. The audience, eager to see the show unfold, had no idea what was about to transpire. Steve felt a quiet anticipation building in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite put into words. He could feel it in the air. Something deeper was about to unfold. Steve introduced his guest with enthusiasm, as always. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man needs no introduction," he said, his voice full of respect. "He's a legend, a living icon, Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in applause as Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage. The man known for his tough guy persona, his no-nonsense demeanor, and his legendary roles in Hollywood looked every bit the part. Stoic, composed, and unfazed by the limelight. Clint, dressed in a simple but timeless suit, gave a nod of acknowledgement to the crowd, his signature quiet charm shining through. He took a seat beside Steve, and the two exchanged a quick handshake. Clint's eyes, however, betrayed something deeper. It wasn't just Hollywood bravado. There was a softness in them, a quiet wisdom. Steve, sensing the subtle shift in energy, smiled but couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be different. There was no laughter in the air yet, no light banter. Instead, there was a feeling of reverence. And so it began, the conversation that would change everything. As Steve and Clint sat down, the energy in the studio felt different. The usual banter Steve was so adept at seemed unnecessary in the moment. Clint Eastwood, a man who had lived through decades of Hollywood history, had a presence that commanded respect. Steve, always the master of lighthearted conversations, found himself strangely quiet, allowing the weight of the moment to settle between them. Clint, in his calm, measured way, looked at Steve with eyes that held both stories and silence. Steve, sensing the shift, leaned in a little closer. The audience, accustomed to Steve's quick wit, couldn't help but notice his focus. He wasn't just performing for the cameras tonight. This was different. The conversation quickly moved past typical Hollywood gossip, the kind of questions Steve would usually ask. Instead, he spoke about the life Clint had lived, the highs, the lows, the lessons. Clint, in his usual understated style, shared insights not just about movies or fame, but about resilience, about what it means to face life's greatest challenges with dignity. "You know, Steve," Clint said quietly, "I've always felt that life doesn't just give you lessons, it throws challenges your way. And the real test is how you respond when the world pushes back." Steve nodded. The words were simple but powerful, and they seemed to resonate deeply with him. It wasn't just Clint's words. It was the way he spoke them, the calm, the certainty in his voice. It was as though Clint had lived through every one of those words. The audience sat silently, feeling the depth of the conversation. Steve, a man known for his larger-than-life energy, found himself in a moment of reflection. For the first time, the jokes and quick comments seemed irrelevant. What Clint was saying mattered more. And as Clint spoke about life's pain and triumph, Steve felt something stir inside him, a feeling he hadn't expected to confront tonight. The conversation shifted once again, this time to something far more personal. Clint Eastwood, the man who had built an empire on playing tough, unyielding characters, suddenly seemed different. There was a subtle vulnerability in his voice as he shared a side of himself the public rarely saw. Steve, sensing that Clint was about to reveal something significant, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on his guest. "I'll tell you, Steve," Clint began, his voice low but clear. "There comes a time in everyone's life when you realize that nothing lasts forever. Not the fame, not the roles, not the people. You start to see things differently." Clint's words struck Steve like a thunderbolt. He had heard similar sentiments before, But coming from Clint, it felt different, more real. Clint paused, his eyes seeming to look through the audience, lost in thought for a moment. The studio, usually filled with laughter and energy, was now eerily silent, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air. The audience, sensing the change in tone, grew still, fully aware that this was no longer a typical talk show conversation. Steve, ever the observer, noticed Clint's expression shift, like he was traveling back in time, to moments of great personal loss. Clint took a slow, steady breath, then continued. I lost my father at a young age. It was the first real experience I had with loss. But you learn quickly that life doesn't stop for you. Steve could see Clint's eyes glisten slightly, though he quickly masked it with a stoic expression. It was a glimpse into the man behind the public persona, the man who had lived through pain, endured it, and moved forward. For a brief moment, the studio felt more like a sacred space than a set. Steve looked at Clint, not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man who had faced life's toughest trials and come out the other side. Clint's words hit Steve harder than expected, and he found himself at a loss for words. As Clint's voice filled the space, Steve Harvey's usual quick wit and effortless humor seemed to fall away. There was no rush to fill the silence, no need to deflect with a joke or a smile. Clint Eastwood had brought something far more profound to the conversation, a truth that Steve wasn't prepared to confront, at least not here, not on live television. Clint had shared a personal piece of himself, a piece that Steve wasn't sure many had ever seen. The quiet power of Clint's words left Steve momentarily speechless. For the first time, Steve was looking at his guest not as a legendary actor, but as a fellow human being, a man who had been touched by the same pain and loss that everyone in the room could relate to. Steve leaned back, his mind swirling with thoughts. The conversation had taken a turn, and with it, something inside Steve began to shift. He felt something stirring deep within him, a place he hadn't let himself visit in years. It was a feeling of connection, of understanding. Clint's honesty, his willingness to open up about the darkness in his own life, had created a space for Steve to reflect on his own journey. You're right, Steve finally said, his voice quieter now, tinged with the weight of the moment. We all go through it, don't we? Loss, pain, and then we have to find a way to keep moving forward. Clint nodded slowly, his eyes softening. You do, he replied simply, but it doesn't mean it gets any easier. You just learn to live with it, make peace with it. Steve's hand moved instinctively to the cross around his neck. It wasn't for show. It was a grounding gesture, something that had become a part of him over the years. But tonight, the weight of it felt different. Clint's words had stirred something deeper. Steve felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Clint's raw honesty. This wasn't the Hollywood version of Clint Eastwood. This was a man who had seen the darkest corners of life and had come out on the other side. The silence between Clint and Steve lingered for a moment, thick with emotion. Steve's fingers absently traced the edges of the crucifix around his neck, a habit he had developed over the years, a way to center himself when the weight of the world felt heavy. Tonight, the weight felt particularly strong. As Clint sat beside him, quietly reflecting on his own experiences, Steve couldn't help but wonder just how much of Clint's true self had been hidden behind the tough, no-nonsense characters he had played over the years. Here in this moment, Clint Eastwood was revealing something far more precious, a vulnerability that few had ever seen. It wasn't the usual polished celebrity persona, the calculated calm of an icon. Instead, it was a man who had experienced grief, loss, and the passage of time. Just like everyone else, Steve felt a deep sense of respect for Clint in that moment. The world may know Clint as a Hollywood legend, but Steve was beginning to see him in a whole new light. It wasn't just the film roles that had shaped Clint. It was his ability to persevere through life's most painful moments that had truly defined him. Steve could feel the weight of Clint's words settling in, and it struck him how much he had taken for granted in his own life. With his usual humor set aside, Steve found himself navigating unfamiliar territory, a conversation that demanded sincerity and honesty. Clint, sensing the emotional shift in Steve, broke the silence. Steve, he said, his voice quiet but unwavering, life It teaches you lessons that nothing else can. You start to realize that the things you thought were important, your career, your image, it all fades away. The only thing that matters is how you treat people, how you love them, and how you show up for them. The simplicity of Clint's words hung in the air, and Steve's eyes softened. For a brief moment, Steve's voice faltered. He had been so focused on the spotlight, the audience, and the next laugh that he hadn't stopped to reflect on the deeper meaning of his work. Tonight, Clint had forced him to look beyond the surface. As Clint spoke, Steve felt a change stir within him, a realization that had been long buried beneath the layers of fame, success, and the day-to-day grind of his career. Clint Eastwood's words cut through the noise, stripping away the distractions and leaving Steve with a profound clarity. The talk show host, who had spent years entertaining millions with his humor and charm, now found himself in a space that required something far deeper: introspection. The audience, sensing the shift, sat in rapt attention, the usual buzz of excitement replaced with a quiet reverence. The air felt thick with emotion, as if everyone in the room could feel the weight of the conversation unfolding. Steve, normally so quick with a joke or a witty remark, found himself struggling to find the right words. Clint had already spoken from the heart, sharing his truth in a way that was rare for someone of his stature. Now Steve needed to find his own truth, to respond in kind. For the first time, Steve didn't feel the pressure to entertain. He wasn't trying to be the funny guy on stage, cracking jokes and leading the conversation. He simply wanted to be present, to listen and to understand. He paused, his gaze drifting to the audience before returning to Clint. "You know, Clint," Steve began, his voice softer than usual, "I've spent my life trying to make people laugh, trying to bring joy into their lives. But tonight, I'm feeling something I haven't felt in a long time. I'm hearing you, and I'm starting to realize that maybe it's not about the laughs. Maybe it's about the heart, the real connection we make with others." Steve's words felt heavy, almost like a confession. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and for the first time in years, he was seeing life and his purpose through a new lens. The crowd remained silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. This wasn't the Steve Harvey they had come to know. This was a Steve Harvey who had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to truly listen. And in that moment, Steve realized that he wasn't just on a talk show anymore. He was on a journey of self-discovery. As the conversation deepened, Clint Eastwood's words continued to resonate with Steve. He could feel the shift in his own heart, something stirring that hadn't been touched in years. For so long, Steve had lived in the fast lane of celebrity, always moving from one project to the next, his life filled with laughter and spectacle. But tonight, in Clint's quiet reflection, Steve had found a moment of stillness. It wasn't a stillness of complacency, but of understanding, a powerful, almost sacred recognition of life's fragility. Steve's eyes softened as he listened to Clint, the weight of his own experiences settling in his chest. "You know, Steve," Clint said with an almost imperceptible smile, "the world will always try to tell you who you should be. The truth is, you can't follow their script. You have to write your own." The simplicity of that statement hit Steve harder than expected. Clint wasn't just talking about movies, about the roles they played on screen. He was speaking about life itself, about the roles they each played in the world, the choices they made, and how they chose to show up for others. Clint's words felt like a balm, soothing a part of Steve that had long been ignored. For years, Steve had believed that his laughter and jokes were what made him valuable. Tonight he realized that his true worth wasn't in what he gave the world, but in how he connected with it, how he made people feel seen and heard. A lump formed in Steve's throat as Clint continued, speaking of love, loss, and the importance of staying grounded. Clint's steady gaze never wavered, his calm presence wrapping around Steve like a cloak of comfort. In the quiet of that moment, Steve realized something profound. Clint was offering him more than just advice. He was offering him the kind of wisdom that could only come from someone who had lived through it all. And Steve knew that this conversation, this very moment, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet between Clint and Steve settling like an unspoken agreement. Steve's usual energetic presence had quieted, replaced with a sense of deep introspection. He was absorbing Clint's every word, the weight of the actor-director's experience reaching into Steve's own soul. Clint had shared so much of himself tonight, his regrets, his triumphs, and the lessons he had learned over the years. It wasn't just a Hollywood conversation anymore. It was a conversation about life, about the choices that define us, and the path we take through pain. As Clint spoke about the importance of doing the right thing and staying true to one's purpose, Steve felt a stirring in his chest. It wasn't just admiration for Clint anymore. It was a deep sense of respect for the wisdom he was offering. And then, in a moment that stunned Steve, Clint leaned forward slightly, his expression changing to something more serious. "Steve," Clint said softly, "sometimes we don't realize the impact we have on others. You think you're just doing your job, making people laugh, entertaining them. But sometimes it's more than that." Steve's breath caught in his throat as Clint continued. "You have a gift, Steve. You make people feel seen, and that's rare. You have no idea how many lives you touch just by showing up the way you do." Steve was taken aback. He had spent so much of his life trying to make people laugh, trying to keep things light, that he never fully realized the weight of his words and actions. He thought he was simply a comedian, a talk show host. But Clint's quiet observation struck him deeply. Steve felt a tear well up in his eye, but he quickly wiped it away, not wanting to show weakness on camera. But Clint, with his unmatched sensitivity, caught it. He paused, allowing the moment to breathe. The words Clint had spoken hung in the air, and for the first time in Steve's career, he wasn't sure what to say next. The magnitude of Clint's compliment, the weight of his belief in him, was too much to process all at once. The studio was as silent as it had ever been, a stillness that had nothing to do with the typical scripted pauses between segments. The audience, who had come to expect humor and excitement, was now fully invested in something far more profound. Steve Harvey, the man they had always known for his charisma and quick wit, was no longer just a showman in front of them. He was a man experiencing something deeply personal, an awakening, if you will. Clint Eastwood's words had hit him in a way that no applause or laughter ever could. Clint's eyes were steady, his voice soft, but what he had just said about Steve, it had the power to change everything. For a moment, Steve just sat there, processing the truth Clint had shared with him. He felt a shift within himself, as if the world he had built around jokes, fame, and entertainment suddenly felt small in comparison to what Clint had just given him. Clint Eastwood, a man known for his iconic roles, for his leadership in the film industry, had just told Steve Harvey something no one had ever truly said before, that he mattered, not for his entertainment or his ability to make people laugh, but for his essence, for the way he made people feel. Steve wiped his eyes again, this time not caring to hide the emotion swelling within him. He could feel the tears welling up, and for once he didn't fight it. He looked at Clint, seeing not just an icon, but a man who understood the power of simple truths. Clint had shared a piece of himself tonight, and in doing so, he had unlocked something in Steve. Clint's voice broke through the silence again. "Steve, sometimes you think you're just making jokes, but what you're really doing is healing people. Your words matter more than you know." The truth of it was undeniable. Steve had spent so much of his life searching for validation in the form of laughs, of applause, and yet here was Clint Eastwood, validating him in a way that was far more profound than anything he could have imagined. The realization hit Steve like a tidal wave. His impact, his work, his heart, it was all far more meaningful than he'd ever given it credit for. As Clint's words sank into Steve's heart, the weight of the moment became almost too much to bear. For years, Steve had put on a mask of laughter, jokes, and lightheartedness, thinking that his purpose in life was to entertain, to keep people smiling. But Clint had opened up a new perspective, one that Steve had never fully considered. What if his purpose wasn't just about making people laugh, but about something deeper? What if he was, in fact, a conduit for healing and light in the lives of others? As Clint spoke again, his voice steady but full of profound understanding, Steve's chest tightened. "Steve," Clint said softly, "it's not the fame, the money, or the recognition that makes us who we are. It's what we give to others, the way we show up for them, and that's what you do. Every time you step onto that stage, every time you speak, you're giving people something that they desperately need, a reason to hope." The words hit Steve with a force he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people he had touched throughout his career, the millions of people who tuned in every night, seeking not just entertainment, but a moment of peace, a moment of connection. It was as if Clint had lifted the veil, showing Steve the true power of his platform. His heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in his life, Steve felt a sense of profound purpose that went beyond the applause and the fame. His eyes welled with tears once more, but this time, he didn't try to hide them. There was no shame in his vulnerability. In fact, it felt liberating. Clint, with his unwavering presence, sat there quietly, watching as Steve processed the truth that had been laid bare before him. The studio, once filled with chatter and excitement, was now silent, as if everyone in the room felt the sacredness of this exchange. And then, as if the entire moment had been building to this, Steve Harvey, who had always been the one to lift others up with his humor and words, found himself being lifted in return by Clint, by his wisdom, by the truth that had been spoken that night. For Steve, this would be a night he would never forget, a night where everything changed. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more powerful tales that touch the heart. Your support means everything. May God bless you.